I don't know how many of you like to watch game shows. Lisa and I do. There's something fun and even a little bit relaxing about seeing people compete. And you can kind of imagine what it would be like to be there. We especially like quiz shows like, Jeopardy. And imagining what it would be like to try to answer the questions, or in the case of Jeopardy, question the answers, before the ones on TV get it done. Or we've always liked Wheel of Fortune and Name That Tune, and there are some newer ones kind of along those veins that are fun. We just watched one called the 1% Club. It's pretty neat. You can fill in your favorite as to what you like to watch. And then there are the ones that kind of focus more on the physical side of things. So, you've got like American Ninja Warrior and Survivor and those of those ilk that they tend to focus more on the physical side of things, the body rather than the mind. And then there's the ones that are just random luck. Things like, Let's Make a Deal or Deal or No Deal. And there's no real skill involved there, at least not much. It's mostly just down to luck of the draw. Then there's some that are just pure talent, like those cooking shows, things like that. And it's fun to imagine standing at that podium and winning big, especially in one of those high stakes matches where all of the winnings can all be done if you just risk it all one more time. Would you wager all of your winnings in Final Jeopardy if the category was right? Would you trade in your briefcase in Deal or No Deal for the chance at a huge win? Now, of course, none of us really know what we would do in those situations until we actually get there. What seems like an easy decision on the couch is probably pretty difficult and nerve-wracking under all those lights and under all that pressure. It's like so many things in life. We imagine we would act one way, but when the time comes, we panic and we forget the simple things. And when the pressure's on, suddenly things seem a lot harder than they looked on the outside. As we finish up this series on the miracles of God, we're going to look at one of those heroes of the Old Testament that always seem to know what to say in every situation. But sometimes even he found himself at a loss for words. When I started this series, I mentioned this a couple of times, but I didn't really have a path through it in mind. Usually when I put a series together, I know from the beginning we're going to go here and here and here and here. It's really easy to do when we're preaching through a book because we're just going to go from the beginning to the end. This time, I just wanted to talk about the way that God makes these miracles happen. How they encourage us to remember who he is. How they remind us that he is still in charge no matter what comes along in life. And so after defining what a miracle is, we started with Moses and the 10 plagues in Egypt. Then we jumped over to Elisha and the healing of Naaman in the time of the kings. And then we jumped back to Moses. And we looked at how God didn't let the Israelites' shoes and clothes wear out. And then back to Elijah and the widow of Zarephath. And once more back over to Moses with the Battle of Jericho. And though I didn't intend to make a pattern there, I kind of did, didn't I? So I figured if we're going to wrap up this series today, we may as well keep the pattern going and talk about probably the second most famous miraculous event in the life of Elijah. I would say the most famous event was how he died. But in front of that is how he brought the rain back to Israel. We've already mentioned it, so just a quick reminder. In Elijah's time, the king of the northern nation of Israel was a man named Ahab. And he, along with his wife Jezebel, had introduced the worship of false god and false gods into the land of Israel in a way that none of the kings and queens before them ever had. They turned the people's hearts toward the Baals and the Ashtoreth, and two gods that I don't even want to describe how they're worshipped. And one day, Elijah showed up in Ahab's throne room and told him, because of his wickedness, God was going to punish him and punish the entire nation. The rain was going to stop. No rain would fall. No dew would be present in the morning. Nothing. and it began immediately. And that curse lasted for 3.5 years. It's during that time that Elijah meets the widow of Zarephath and raises her son back to life. But then the time came. Elijah got the message from God. It's time to go back to Ahab. It's time to turn the rain back on. But this isn't going to be just an ordinary message. Elijah is not an ordinary prophet, and so when he speaks for God, he doesn't just pass along a message. He does it in overly dramatic ways. Remember when he met the widow? She only had a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil left, just enough for herself and her son. And what did Elijah tell her? He did not come to her and say, God is going to multiply your flour and your oil, so don't be afraid. He did not say, I am a prophet of God, so you can trust me. He said, why don't you go in there and make me a cake with what you have left, and then you and your son can have what's left over. When her son died, he didn't raise the boy from the dead like other resurrections in the Bible. Even Jesus usually just held out his hand and lifted them from their bed, or just called their name to have the dead person rise. Elijah? No, he lays across the boy and prays at the top of his lungs. Later on, when another wicked king is on the throne, Elijah sends a group of messengers to the king. The king is sick. He's laid in bed, and he sent out a bunch of messengers to an Egyptian god and said, you go ask that God how I can be healed. Well, Elijah catches them on the way, and he says, no, you go back to the king and tell him, because you did this, because you didn't seek out the one true God, you're never getting out of your bed again. So they go back and they tell the king, and the king is so angry, he sends 50 soldiers and their captain to execute Elijah. Elijah is not hiding. He's sitting on top of a hill. And the soldiers and the captain come to Elijah and they say, you're coming with us. We're taking you back home to be executed. And Elijah strikes them dead. But he doesn't just speak and strike them dead or snap his fingers or anything like that. He calls down fire from heaven. So the king gets angry, sends another 50. That 50 does the same thing, and Elijah does the same thing, calls down fire from heaven. So the king sends a third group of 50. And this time the captain, apparently a man of common sense, says, in essence, Elijah, please don't shoot the messengers. We don't want to be here either. And Elijah says, okay, I'll go with you. And then he tells the king to his face he's going to die in his bed. Elijah does things in these big, bombastic, dramatic ways. So when it comes to bringing back the rain to Israel, you know it's going to be something big. I want you to turn with me. 1 Kings chapter 18. 1 Kings chapter 18. And keep your Bible open because we're going to go through the whole chapter here. I want you to be able to follow along with me. We're just going to start in verse 1. 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 1. I get to the right place there. After many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the third year, saying, go show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. And when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and fed them with bread and water. Ahab said to Obadiah, go through the land to all the springs of water, to all the valleys. Perhaps we may find grass and save the horses and mules alive and not lose some of the animals. So they divided the land between themselves to pass through it. And Ahab went in one direction by himself, and Obadiah went in the other direction by himself. And as Obadiah was on the way, behold, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him and fell on his face and said, is it you, my lord Elijah? He answered him and said, it is I. Go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah's here. He said, how have I sinned that you would give your servant into the hand of Ahab to kill me? As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my Lord is not sent to seek you. When they would say he's not here, he would take an oath of the kingdom or nation that they had not found you. And now you say, go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah's here. And as soon as I've gone from you, the Spirit of the Lord will carry you I know not where. And so when I come and tell Ahab and he can't find you, he'll kill me. although I, your servant, have feared the Lord from my youth. Has it not been told, my Lord, that what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord, how I hid 100 men of the Lord's prophets by 50s in a cave and fed them with bread and water? And now you say, go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah's here, and he's going to kill me. Elijah said, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, is it you, O troubler of Israel? He answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you've abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to meet me at Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Elijah doesn't just show up and talk to the king. He calls one of the king's servants to him and says, go introduce me. Go tell the king I'm here. And the servant, Obadiah, not the same Obadiah that wrote the minor prophet book, Obadiah says, are you crazy? The king's been looking everywhere for you. In every nation around the globe. He's been searching everywhere. Now you show up out of the blue, and you expect me to just go over to the king, tell him you're over here. I know what's going to happen. As soon as I turn my back, you're going to disappear again. The king is going to kill me instead. But Elijah reassures him, and the message gets sent. And when the king comes to him, Elijah does not say anything about bringing back the rain. Remember, that's the whole point of this visit. Instead, he says, I've got a game for you. I've got a challenge for you. You want to follow these false gods? Let's see what they're made of. You meet me up on the mountaintop. You bring as many Israelites as will come, but especially bring me the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah, and we'll find out once and for all who the real God is. So the king meets with Elijah. And with him come these prophets of these false gods, hundreds of them, and an audience of the nation of Israel. And Elijah gets up in front of everyone and says, listen up. You cannot jump back and forth between following these gods and the one true God. It's time to make a decision. But don't worry about that. I'm going to help you decide. Look at verse 20. So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel, gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, even I only am left a prophet of the Lord. But Baal's prophets are men. Let 2 bulls be given to us. Let them choose 1 bull for themselves, cut it into pieces, lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood and put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood. Oh, no, skip that part. And you call upon the name of your God, and I'll call upon the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. All the people answered, it is well spoken. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose for yourselves 1 bull. You prepare it first, for you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it. This would be the point of the game show where all the spotlights focus on the MC, the host. Okay, here's the rules. We're going to see who is God and who isn't. You cannot serve both. Literally what the language here says is, how long are you going to try and balance on one leg? And then when that one gets tired, try to balance on the other. You need to plant your feet in one spot. So choose a side. Here's the rules. You get a bull, and I get a bull. We have 2 altars. We're going to sacrifice the bulls, and whichever bull is roasted by fire from the sky, you know that God is real. Make sense? The people agree. And just to make it even more fair, just to prove I'm not doing anything fishy, I'm going to let you go first. I'm going to let you choose which bull to pick. So the dramatic music picks up. The prophets of Baal get ready to prove that they are right. Back to verse 26. They took the bull that was given to them and they prepared it and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud, for he's a god. Either he's musing or he's relieving himself, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened." And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. So the prophets of these false gods butcher their bull. They lay the pieces out on their altar, and they do their absolute best to get Baal to answer them. It's one of the most pathetic and somehow kind of entertaining spectacles in Scripture. For hours, they call on the name of Baal. At first, they circle their altar, and they've got a lot of energy, but then they're calling out, "Oh, Baal, answer us." They even kick over Elijah's altar in their fervor. But as the hours drag on, as they keep crying out, not getting any answer at all, they start to lose the fire a little. They start to slow down. About noon, Elijah decides maybe they need a little bit of help. "Don't slow down now, guys. You must be almost there. You just got to shout louder." Maybe Baal's in the back room. Maybe he's napping. Maybe he had to visit the little god's room. Keep going, guys. Baal's real, right? Surely you just need a little extra to get his attention. So the prophets resort to cutting themselves. This was a common practice for pagan gods. It was expressly forbidden by God's law in Leviticus 19. I don't know if any of you ever watched professional wrestling, especially in the early days of its popularity. But there was something that was very common in those matches that was called blading. And the idea was the wrestler would take a razor blade and he would cut himself, usually on the forehead, either right along the hairline or inside a wrinkle so that you couldn't see it when it was there. And if you do that, and you do that enough, what would happen is a line of scar tissue builds up. And from that point on, all it takes is a little hit or just a little poke with a hidden blade, and suddenly they'd start to bleed profusely. And now they're not really hurt, they're just bleeding. And of course, they found that if you do that in the ring, people get more popular. That practice has since been banned, but it's the same idea here. These men, the priests of Baal, would cut themselves along their arms and legs, and they did that enough that there were track lines on there, buildup of scar tissue, so that when you went to go worship Baal, you could just prick this and you'd be bleeding all over the place because that's what Baal wanted from you. So these priests had all these scars up and down their arms. It's easy to break open a wound, try to get Baal's attention, and we see them do this. But of course, this is all to no avail. Baal didn't listen. Verse 29 is so expressly sad. There was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. And that's when Elijah says, "Okay, you've had literally all day. Now it's my turn." Verse 30. Elijah said to the people, "Come near to me." All the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar, as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. He put the wood in order, cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. He said, "Fill 4 jars with water, pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." They did it a second time. He said, "Do it a third time." They did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar, filled the trench also with water. And at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know you, O Lord, our God, that you have turned their hearts back." Then the fire of the Lord fell, consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Let not one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. Elijah starts by repairing the altar that the prophets had knocked down in their fervor. He builds it back in exactly the same way that the altars of old were built. 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel, stones that nothing had ever cut. He builds the altar, places the wood on top of it, slaughters the bull, steps back and says, "Nah, this is too easy for you, God. Let's really give him a show." So he digs a trench around the altar, deep enough that you could pour in 3.5 gallons of seed. Then he calls for water, a lot of water. Remember, they're in the middle of the end of a 3.5-year drought. This is precious stuff. 12 jars full of water that have now soaked the meat, the wood, and the altar so much that it fills the trench in the ground. And remember, there has been no rain. They can't waste this stuff. And now there's no way that this could light on fire. And this boisterous prophet, who is usually the one who is standing and hollering and being at the top of his lungs, does not act like those others. He doesn't dance around or scream at the top of his lungs. He simply speaks, "God, it's your turn. You show these people the truth. Show them that you're the one true God. Make them realize how foolish they've been. Turn their hearts back to you." And then the flame falls. And the way it's described is like being at the center of a bomb dropping. The flames eat up the bull, the wood. They vaporize the stones of the altar. They flash fry the water and don't even leave the dust behind. And the people have no choice but to acknowledge who the true God really is. They execute all the prophets of Baal and Asherah, and the winner of the contest is clear. And that would be enough. But that's not where the story ends. Ahab, the king, is still present. We're not told if Ahab was one of those that acknowledged God in that moment. I like to think that maybe he was. Now, he goes back to his wickedness pretty quickly. But I like to think that in that moment, he recognized who God really was. So Elijah tells him, "Go have supper," because the show's not over yet. 41, Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of the rushing of rain." So Ahab went up to eat and drink, and Elijah went to the top of the Mount Carmel, and he bowed himself down on the earth, and he put his face between his knees. He said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." So he went up and looked and said, "There's nothing." And he said, "Go again 7 times. And at the 7th time he said, Behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea. He said, "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stop you." And in a little while, the heavens grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel, and the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he gathered up his garment, ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. Now, I don't know if this is true, but again, I've always kind of thought that in that moment, Ahab was one of the ones that turned his heart back to God. Because how could you deny the truth of what he had just seen? But Elijah tells him there's one more thing you need to see. So as Ahab eats and rests, Elijah is on the lookout for a tiny little cloud. And when he finds out that that little tiny cloud has appeared, he goes to Ahab and says, "You better run, because it looks like rain." That little tiny cloud, the size of a man's hand, soon turns into a torrential downpour. Ahab in his chariot has to gallop full speed to stay ahead of the floodwaters. Leaving Mount Carmel, heading toward Jezreel, he would have ridden down a dry valley called a wadi. Specifically, it would be what is today called the Wadi Nahal Oren. A wadi is known for 2 things: being dry in the dry times and flooding in the wet times. Ahab wanted the rains to come back, and he got it. And Elijah ends up running faster than him, beating him to Jezreel. And that's where the story continues, but that's where we're going to stop. There's enough in that story for us to chew on. I really like an outline that I found at one point, and I've tweaked it a little bit, that just takes this story and breaks it down into something that we can take home with us. These miracle stories are more than just encouragement for the ones who saw the miracle. They serve as examples for us. So here's the question we want to answer when we're looking at this story. When it's time to call on God for a miracle, why should he listen to you? Trouble comes in life, and only God can fix it. Why should he listen to your cries for help? Why did he listen to Elijah? Well, this story starts with a contest. Elijah versus the prophets? Kind of. God versus Baal? Not really, because Baal never existed in the first place. No, this is a contest between God and the hearts of Israel. Elijah does not stand before the crowd and address Baal. He really doesn't call out the prophets of Baal in any meaningful way. He at least doesn't ask them to change. He begins by addressing the crowd, the people. And he tells them it's time for you to make a decision. When it comes to us and our relationship with God, the contest is not God versus Satan. That battle is already won. It's not God versus our problems, although we kind of like to put it that way sometimes. It's God versus our hearts, our worldview, our way of thinking. Think about how this world grabs at our attention, and the contest is clear. God says, I want you wholehearted, devoted completely to me. Satan wants the opposite. We have to decide, and we get to decide who wins that battle. Who do we focus on? But that only happens when we realize there's a contest happening, when we realize there is a battle. From the contest, we move into commotion. Why is it so difficult sometimes to make that decision? Why does it seem like the world is often yelling at us louder than God is? Because it is. The world shouts. The world waves its arms and flashes the pretty lights, and it fills us with this idea that we're missing out if we don't head that way. The world has come to call it FOMO, the fear of missing out. But that's not new. FOMO has been there since the beginning. It was the cause of the very first sin. If you keep reading, God emphasizes this to Elijah in the next chapter, where Elijah's up on the mountain, and he's now in this depression mode, where he says, I'm the only one left, nobody's listening to me. And God comes to him. But he doesn't come in an earthquake or a tornado or a volcano. He speaks softly. And he does the same with us many times. He speaks to us, even in our troubles, and usually it is very quietly through his word. From commotion, we move into construction. The prophets and all their commotion tore down the altar of God, and Elijah took time to rebuild it. And not only rebuild it, but rebuild it right. And as we look around, the world loves nothing more than to tear down the sacred. You don't have to look for too long to find people who are willing to tell you how foolish you are for what you believe. How Christianity is nothing but a bunch of bigots, hypocrites, liars, murderers, and cheats. Do you know what the church is really made of? A bunch of bigots, hypocrites, liars, murderers, and cheats that have chosen to rebuild what was knocked down in their lives. That relationship with the Almighty that we all walked away from, we broke down that altar in our lives, but God allows us to rebuild, to step back to a place of peace with him. We have to come like Elijah. We have to do it on his terms, but when we come, the results are things we cannot argue with. After construction comes communion. Once the altar was rebuilt, Elijah stopped paying attention to the prophets. He ignored the king, focused away from the people. He simply looked to God. God, this is all in your hands. Only you can make this happen. Only you will get the glory when it does. Everything he said was focused on God. It wasn't, hey, God, beat these prophets for me. Give Baal a black eye. Nothing like that. He said, God, please show everyone the truth that I already know. You are God, you and you alone. And when we come to God on his terms and we face hurdles in life, whether they're small, big, or massive, we're able to do the same. God, you step in here. I trust in your goodness. I trust in you. You are God, you alone. You get all the glory. And after communion came the conflagration. With God, when God moves, there is no doubt. There was not a single intelligent person on that mountain that would doubt that God was behind that fire. And when you sit attuned with God, you have the privilege of getting to see him move. The things that this world calls coincidence, we can see as pattern. Even those things when he chooses not to answer in the way that we really want him to, we can often look back and say, well, yes, that did turn out better. And we have a promise that he always works things out for the good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And one day, I hope we get to look back and see all the times we missed the fire falling. I hope we get to see the times that he withheld the fire and it worked out anyway. And that will lead to nothing more than confession. The people couldn't help but say, the Lord, he is God. We see the movement of God. And when we see when he doesn't move. And in either case, if we trust him, we're still going to confess his goodness. We give him the glory in the miracle and in the absence of the miracle. And he truly is the God of the impossible because he can take both and make them work out for the best. And when we have that mindset, we can focus our attention on where it needs to be, including sometimes correction. With the focus on God's glory, with our eyes where they need to be, we can then see where we stray from the path. When we work on correcting that path, we expose the falsehoods in our lives. And like the prophets of Baal, with the Spirit's help, we can take them out. And we work toward being the people that God wants us to be. And one more. From commotion to construction to communion to conflagration to confession and correction at the end, we get a cloudburst. One thing we learn when we start to see God move is that when you start to see it happen, get out of the way. Once you know the power of the Almighty, you know you don't want to be there when he's headed through. Like a squirrel in the path of a semi, you either catch a ride or you get squashed. And ultimately, again, we will look back and see he's been moving since the beginning, and he will continue through my life and the generations to come until he comes again. There is a reason this story speaks to all of us. It's our story. One day we took a step away from God and we started to listen to the world, but then he did everything to win us back. We stand here today because he offered us a way back to him. We celebrate the God of the impossible because he did the ultimate impossible act. He paid the debt that we could never pay. He proved himself where he did not need to prove himself. And those of us who have obeyed, who have believed and repented and confessed his name, met him in the grave of baptism, we can say with no embarrassment at all, God, I need you. I need you to step into my life. I need you in my situations. I need you because without you, I've got nothing. And as we come to our invitation hymn, that's exactly what we're going to sing. And you're going to have to use your books for this one, because apparently when I put the PowerPoint together, I put the prayer hymn at the end of the PowerPoint, at the end. So don't sing the words that show up. Sing the words in your book. Without him, I don't have a prayer. Without him, I can't do anything. It's number 498 in your book, if you want to turn there. 498. Without him, what blessing is in life? Without him, what hope do I have? But you can also look at that song and say, with him, I know what I have. I know the God that is at my back, the God of the impossible. Let's stand and sing.